Good morning. This week, we are looking at the last week of Jesus's life from the book of Mark. And I have the third day of his life, which was a really busy day for Jesus. You can find this day recorded in Mark chapter 11, verse 20, all the way through the end of chapter 13. He spends his day teaching his disciples and answering questions from the religious leaders. Even as the end of his life is coming, Jesus spends his time. Meanwhile, are busy trying to trap Jesus. I am going to read to you from Mark chapter 12, verses 13 through 17 in N.T. Wright's translation. They sent to Jesus some Pharisees and some Herodians to try to trick him into saying the wrong thing. Teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity. You don't regard anybody as special. You don't bother about the outward show people put up. You teach God's way truly. Well then, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Should we pay it or shouldn't we? He knew the game that they were playing. Why are you trying to trap me? He said. Bring to me a tribute penny. Let me look at it. They brought one to him. This image, he asked, whose is it? And whose is this superscription? Caesar's, they replied. Well then, said Jesus, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. And they were astonished at him. Often when we read this, we tend to think of it very literally because we're pretty literal people. So we think, well, of course they're supposed to pay their taxes, especially, and Jesus shows them this by showing that the picture is on the coin. And then they're supposed to give to God what belongs to God, which we understand they were supposed to tithe. So we think, well, they're still supposed to give to the temple because they're supposed to give to God what belongs to God. We're done. They give some to taxes and some to the temple, and then the rest is for them. We know also that the Jews hated paying taxes to the Romans, and that's how the religious leaders were trying to trap Jesus. They were putting him into a no-win situation, because if Jesus said to pay taxes, then the Jews would be mad, and if he said not to pay taxes, then the Romans, he'd be in trouble with the Romans. So Jesus gives a really clever answer. But I don't want to focus so much right now on his clever answer as much as on what he says at the end. Give to God what belongs to God. So what does Jesus mean by this? Some of the things that we might think of that also happened that day. In the temple, Jesus goes to the temple with his disciples, and he sees some very wealthy people putting a lot of money into the temple treasury. And then he sees a widow who goes and puts in 2 small copper coins. And he turns to his disciples and he praises her for giving all that she has. Also later that same day, in chapter 12, a teacher of the law comes to him and says, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus answers, to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't say to give part of yourself to God, or to make sacrifices in the temple, or to love God after you've loved all these other people. He says to love God with everything that you have, and to love others the way you love yourself, which is really the most that any of us can love anyone else. So what does God mean, give to God? Or what does Jesus mean? What does Jesus mean, give to God what belongs to God? I think he means all of us. What belongs to God is all of who I am, every bit of me. We owe our very lives to God, to the God who created us and loves us and sustains us and saves us. So while we pay our taxes or take care of our obligations, everything about us belongs to God. I don't know about y'all, but I know that I have hit a wall this week with the social isolation or social distancing, physical distancing, whatever we want to call it these days. It's lost its luster. It's getting harder. It's not easy. But in the midst of this time, I'm trying to remember when I wake up and feel discouraged to keep persevering and seeking God. So I want to encourage us today in the midst of everything happening, let's really give ourselves completely over to God. There's really no time like the present. We have fewer distractions than ever. There's nowhere to rush off to, no big events to plan. Really, it's hard to make any plans for the near future because we really don't know when this is going to change, when our lives will feel like they go back to normal. We have fewer people around to distract us unless you have young children, and then you may have more people around to distract you. I know a lot of people are juggling. We're really different. So, what it looks like for one person to give themselves completely over to God today, it may look different for someone else. Someone who's physically alone all day, it's going to look different than someone who has small children running around all day. But all of us can practice giving ourselves over to God. So, my thought for you today is, how can you give yourself over to God today? How can you become completely God's today? Let's really persevere in seeking God and spending time with Him and loving Him and obeying Him. As we hit these walls, let's remember that the most important thing that we can do is to be people who love God with all of our hearts, souls, mind, and strength, and to love neighbors as ourselves. No matter what week we are living in, let us be like Jesus and continue to be about going about the Father's business.